Hey everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. I hope all is well with you. I just wanted to do this quick video for you about Reconstruction. Before getting to the Reconstruction video, just thanks again for chatting a little bit on Thursday about some of the issues at BCA, some of the stress and the workload, issues of mental health. I did get a chance to share some of what you had developed with some colleagues. So I think it's just going to be an ongoing conversation, something that we'll continue to talk about. So I will get a chance, I think, on Tuesday. Maybe we can touch base about that. But for this video, this is a video that has a little bit of background for you about Reconstruction. Some of this is really Reconstruction from the perspective of like presidential Reconstruction and what that entailed, and the radical Republicans' response to that, and then radical Republican Reconstruction. It's really the Republicans' version in Congress. Radicals and moderates together are going to develop a Reconstruction plan that's going to counter the president's version. And there's a lot of tension between these two groups. It really explains the time period of 1865, 1866, 1867. And 1867 is largely when radical Reconstruction will start. But a couple of things, and this video is just going to be a little bit of a background video, some context, and it should help you add some notes to the 4 questions that you had in class last week. There were a couple of sources that you were looking at, and so I'll note some of those sources, and we'll look at 1 or 2 of them in class tomorrow. But for the most part, you should be able to either add some information or note if you have a question or something like that. The first question was really all about the president's Reconstruction plan, and we looked at that in class. That's probably a question you've already got completed. Andrew Johnson was the president that is being referred to for presidential Reconstruction. Johnson was the president who replaced Lincoln when Lincoln was assassinated, and sorry about that, the video cut out. Some things we do know about Johnson: he was somebody who was really not a Republican for the most part. He was put on Lincoln's ticket as a political pick and was in the election of 1864 as vice president, but he was a white supremacist. He had slaves at one point. He freed those slaves, but he was largely somebody who believed in the Union, thought that the Union should come together, the Confederacy shouldn't have seceded, but there was also a belief that, he doesn't see any form of equality for Black Americans. So there's no justice in Johnson's plan. It's largely going to be an easy way for the South to come back into the Union and for the Union to exist kind of in a whole piece again. For the most part, we look at Johnson's plan as having the following pieces, and this was outlined on the video that we watched in class, so this is just like a little bit of review for a second. Some of the things that he noted was you had a simple oath if you were Confederate and you were serving in the military during the time period of the Civil War. You ultimately just had to take a loyalty oath. There were a few exceptions for individuals who couldn't easily gain loyalty. If they were wealthy planters, they had to come to Washington, D.C. to get a special pardon from Johnson. But for the most part, we see large numbers of Confederates easily being able to receive amnesty. There's also the precedent that the states have to create new constitutions, and the constitutions are going to be established under a constitutional convention. So there's like a provisional governor that gets picked, new constitutions get written, and because the people who gained amnesty are able to participate in politics and voting and serving, largely the individuals who are making the decisions about the new state constitutions are the former Confederates. And in the new constitutions, the one piece that really had to be incorporated into the Constitution was the 13th Amendment. So that's slavery would no longer be in the South. But there's really nothing in Johnson's plan that's granting any additional equality to freedmen. The outrage is going to be significant in the Republican-led Congress. Johnson's plan really gets created when Congress is out of session. So when the pardons start to begin and people are creating constitutions, and then states are now going to be sending delegates to Washington, D.C., this is going to mean lots of Confederate participation. And the northern senators, the northern members of the House are really going to put up a lot of issue about this. There's also some reality that the southern state constitutions were falling short of what some of the requirements were, and there's a lot of Southern defiance, efforts to essentially, for all intents and purposes, put slavery, back into place. And there's a few ways in which the rights and specific equalities of for freed people are limited. And one big way this occurs is through land. There had been discussions about granting land to individuals who are freed Black Americans. Largely that doesn't happen. Some individuals do get land. For example, in Georgia, we had looked at a source, earlier, the last few weeks about, enslaved persons who speak to William Tecumseh Sherman and his men as they're marching through Atlanta, and they get some land. Well, that land immediately goes back to Confederate hands. And as the South becomes part of the Union again, they make claims for their land, and a lot of the abandoned land that the Freedmen's Bureau had been governing largely goes to individuals who were, on the Confederate side. And this creates a lot of, ways that for African Americans, the argument is they had also worked the land, and they had also spent generations, working the land, and as a result had some ability to own that land. So there becomes like a whole bunch of discussions about how do we know, what is just and what should occur in terms of redistributing some of the land that was worked on by enslaved people, but also was owned by slaveholders. And when that land becomes up for grabs, and under Johnson's plan, it's largely going to go to the slaveholders. The other issue we see is the Black Codes. The southern states and their constitutions, they start to legislate. And in the South, the legislation creates not only no policies for equality or special rights or protection of civil rights for freed people. Instead, we see a great number of laws that are going to restrict some of the movement, some of the rights, some of the ability to create contracts, some of the, making it easy in a lot of cases, some of the Black Codes, and they vary by state to state. So the Alabama Black Code is different than the Mississippi Black Code, which is different than the Georgia Black Code. And we'll look at some excerpts in class on Tuesday about the Mississippi Black Codes. It's actually a really challenging document because quite a bit of the consequences of the Black Codes lend themselves to high rates of arrests of African Americans who are one-time enslaved, where they get put back under after arrest back to a slaveholder who is going to employ them. And because they had been perhaps arrested, there's all things in the Mississippi. And we'll look at the document. It'll be a little easier to explain it with the document. But the slave codes create an environment that seems almost like a cycle where upon some sort of perceived wrongdoing, there becomes opportunity for a system that largely seems, to some degree, like enslavement, and the Black Codes become very significant. The reason the southern states are putting in the Black Codes are to not only repress some of the civil rights of African Americans, but also to ensure a stable labor supply. So because there was no slavery, the southern states are creating ways to maintain the system that had been in place. And the Black Codes provide some ways to do that. And there is a pre-emancipation system, of race relations. One of the sources that, I read recently, is kind of titled, the white man is always right. So if there was a contract, who wrote the contract, who created the contract, who ultimately, noted all the things in the contract, was often the white man who was at one time slaveholder, now is seen as employer. But the contracts were often one-sided, and if there was an issue between two people, there was very little ways in which to appeal if you were a former slave, perhaps even working on the same land that your family had for generations. There was very little ability to gain any types of protection. The Freedmen's Bureau was designed to protect individuals with those issues of contracts, but in reality, the phrase, the white man was always right, that source, really speaks to something. The Black Codes also forced many freedmen to largely become, sharecroppers. This idea of having their own land, really being able to have a consistent income and employment became really difficult with the Black Codes. They were almost designed intentionally to make it difficult for African Americans to hold employment. The tendency was for there to be sharecropping, really where there was a lot of exploitation, not as great of an income, and people had to do and use only the land that the employer wanted them to, and there was a lot less economic gain that happened as a result of sharecropping. Congress did ultimately break with the president, and this is where we see some of what becomes radical Reconstruction. But to give you a little bit idea of the timeline, Congress does try to bar the Southern delegates, not let them in. I mean, we see the Confederate, leader, the vice president, Alexander Stephens of the vice presidency, kind of comes to Congress. All of those things create a huge attempt for members of the Republicans to ban or to bar the Southerners from coming in. There's also a joint committee on Reconstruction, so there's large-scale effort to collect information. Something that the Republicans really do is they enable Confederate members to come in and talk about Reconstruction. There's a great amount of information that gets collected by the Joint Committee. Surprisingly to the Republicans, maybe not surprising to us, but surprising to the Republicans, they do try to kind of play Johnson's game a little bit. And within his Reconstruction plan, they decide they're going to try to work with him, and they create two laws. One is an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau, figuring that just needs to get extended for one more year. That's something that they can put in front of Johnson. The other thing the Congress writes is what's called the 1866 Civil Rights Act. It's actually very significant because it's the first time we really see citizenship rights that are going to be guaranteed for individuals who are born in the United States. This creates federal citizenship. There had not been this before the 1866 Civil Rights Act. There's also a movement to ensure that there's equal protection under the laws. This means that, blacks and whites can't be treated differently in the eyes of the law. So all those things, we saw back in the Virginia laws and ways in which people were treated differently based on color of skin. This is going to create a Civil Rights Act that's going to stop that. At the same time, the president is going to veto both the continuation of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Act. So neither of those really are able to continue because the president vetoes them. The Republicans in 1866, there is a congressional a lot of elections in Congress that same year, and there's a great deal of efforts to override the president's veto, which does happen. So the Civil Rights Act actually does occur, and the Freedmen's Bureau bill does get continued, and the radical Republicans win a great deal of votes in 1866. So they have, in a sense, like the wind at their backs in an effort to try to push back against the plan that President Johnson had pushed. This is the first time in history where we see a president, kind of vetoing, all of these different bills, and then Congress overriding them. That becomes really significant.